Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Kafav. A few short reminders. First of all, you can still register for bookmarks if you haven't yet. So registration is up till after the Chagim, and then we'll start sending them out. And in terms of Zoom, there will be no Zoom on Monday next week. And on Sunday, that means that basically on Sunday, for anyone who wants to get ahead, I'll be posting Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday's Dapim, which will get you through, at least for those who have one day of Chag, it'll get you through the first day of Chag. Okay, and then Wednesday there will be a live class as usual. Today's daf is sponsored by Miriam Benson, in loving memory of her mother, Evelyn Benson, Yochevet Bat Avraham Leib V'chaya Batya, on her first year at cited. To honor her memory, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, get vaccinated, support Israel, go see Downtown Abbey, the grand finale, and, of course, study Torah. Okay, with that, we will get started. Okay, we saw it yesterday, at the end of yesterday's daf, if you cause a blemish to an animal after the slaughtering, which we might have thought doesn't matter, the animal's already slaughtered, but we see if it was before you accepted the blood, okay, because it says, V'lakach midam hapal, why did it say the par again? We know it's the par, must be par shayakvar. The animal, the bull or any animal for any sacrifice has to be at the same status it was before, meaning it can't be blemished. So if it's blemished, it's not accepted. Then we said we see that by Kochim Kochim. Where do we see it by Kochim Kochim? We brought that case about Pesach, and then we couldn't prove it from there. However, I just want to point out, the commentaries say that anyway it's true for Kochim Kochim anyway, even though we didn't find a proof. Okay? So I kind of seem to think otherwise yesterday because I said, we don't have a proof for Kochim Kochim, but I looked it up and it seems like everyone thinks it's applicable to Kochim Kochim as well. That if there's a moon between the time that you slaughtered it and the time that you accepted the blood, it's still a problem. You can't sacrifice it. So now, in that issue, or really, we're going to get off on a different issue by these statements made by Rabbi Ami in the name of Rabbi Elazar, which we're going to raise a question ultimately from what we saw yesterday about Sarem Ozen. But the topic really isn't Sarem Ozen and a mum. The topic is something else. It has to do with what's called the boundaries of the azara. What we learned about chutz l'mkomo, if you have a thought that you're going to mess up something because you're going to do it outside its location. We learned already that there's a place things have to be, and if you take them out of there, it disqualifies it. So like the blood or the meat of the flesh of the animal can't be taken out of the azara. Okay, so let's give some examples. The blood can never be taken out of the azara. Okay, once you slaughter the animal, right, you have the blood. If the blood gets taken out, disqualified. If you have the meat of the animal, it really depends. Okay, certainly once the blood is sprinkled, and we'll see today there's a bit of an issue. What about before the blood is sprinkled? Once the blood, okay, kochim can never leave the azara, the meat. The meat has to be eaten by kohanim and in the azara only. Okay. But kochim kalim, the meat can actually go out of the azara. The blood can, but the meat can. The question is, and we'll see this comes up as a debate, what about before the blood is sprinkled? Because the blood sprinkling permits the meat to be eaten, and then the meat can be eaten anywhere inside the walls of Jerusalem, which is why it can go out of the azara. But what about before the blood is sprinkled? That's a debate, actually. Whether the meat goes out, is that going to disqualify it or not? Because at this point, you're not allowed to eat the meat yet, so maybe until you've sprinkled the blood, maybe it can't leave, or maybe it can, because ultimately it's going to be able to leave, so it's not going to disqualify it if it leaves. Anyway, those are some issues that are going to come up. We haven't seen them yet inside, but we will. Amar Rabbi Ami, Amar Rabbi Elazar. So you needed the background, because now we're going to get to a complicated case, so that which assumes you know everything that I just told you. He bifnim v'ragla b'chutz. So Rabbi Elazar is quoted as saying the following. If the animal is inside the azara when you're going to slaughter it, and its legs are outside. Okay, so here we have part of the animal is outside. Now this is when the animal's alive. Okay, when the animal's alive, the animal could obviously be outside before you slaughter it because the animals come from outside the azara. That certainly doesn't disqualify it. And then if chatach, if you cut the leg off, v'achar kach shachat, and then you slaughtered it. So at that point, no part of the animal is outside. It's obviously fine. Kshira, okay, because you slaughtered it, nothing was outside at the moment of the slaughtering. But shachat va'achar kach chatach psula. But if you slaughtered it and then cut off the leg, okay, presumably before you accepted the blood, then it's disqualified. Why? Because now you have to think about how bodies of animals work, or humans or anyone, but the blood is circulating. Okay, there's like a moment in between shechita and Kabbalah. There's not a lot of time, okay? But if somehow the leg was cut off right after shechita, then what happens? Well, the blood that was outside circulated and moved inside. So now, Tina, your question the Gemara is going to ask in a minute. That's why this is brought here, so hold off. But you're okay. I'll just, for those who don't see Tina's question, she's asking, but isn't the animal blemished? That's obviously why they brought it here, because now you see the animal's blemished after, right? Or the animal's blemished before. This actually is more of a problem because the animal was blemished before you even slaughtered it. We'll get back to the blemish. But right now we're focusing just on the issue of outside. The blood is circulating. So if the blood was outside when you slaughtered the animal, the leg was outside, then there's blood outside. And then that blood comes back into the animal, right, into the other part of the animal and goes out the neck when you slaughter it. So you're going to end up with blood that was outside the azara. And that's why if you slaughtered it and then cut off, if you cut off the leg before the slaughtering, then there's no blood from outside that's coming inside. But if you cut off the leg after the slaughtering happened, then the blood that's coming out from the slaughter is actually going to be from that leg that was outside, and that blood was outside then, and it's a problem. So the Gemara asks Tina's question, which is, how could you have cut off the leg and then slaughter the animal? You're slaughtering a blemished animal. Okay, so change what we said. It must be you slaughtered it, and then you slaughtered it, then you cut the leg after the slaughtering. So it wasn't blemished at the time of the slaughter, and then you accepted the blood. And then it would be kshera. And then, because again, at this point, we're going to assume that if you cut it before the blood was accepted, even though it was after the slaughter, maybe you'd say the blood then from there doesn't really get into what's coming out. But if you accepted the blood and then cut it, then it's disqualified because then you have, if the leg was still there when the blood was coming out, then obviously you're getting blood that was from outside. The Gemara says, but that's still a problem in light of what we saw yesterday. And this is why the sugya is here. How could you? Okay, so you're right. You slaughtered an animal that was perfectly fine. But you accepted the blood of an animal that was blemished. And didn't we say, Ha'amar Rabbi Zera, Hatzorem ozen bebechor, va'achar kach kibel damo pasul, shene'emar v'lakach midam apal, parshaya kfal. So you can't accept blood of an animal that was blemished. So that wouldn't work either. So now we're going to have an answer that basically is going to say, this blemish issue has nothing to do with anything here. This animal wasn't actually blemished. Okay, and we're going to explain that it was cut in a way that didn't cause a mum, and that actually resolves even the first version. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to change it to the second version. You keep this resolves both versions. You cut all the flesh and the veins and all the blood that's coming out of there, but you left the bone. If the bone is still intact, the animal is not considered blemished. So that's how we explain the issue with the previous sugya. Okay, now we're just going to be in this sugya as opposed to the previous sugya. Okay, the reason why we brought this was really because of the tzarem ozen, and that this basically the second version here. Right, the first version was a problem of blemish, and the second version was a problem of the blemish that was mentioned by Rabbi Zera yesterday. And now we're going to deal though with this sugya itself, with the fact that we have blood. Okay, now we're going to talk about the fact that there's blood in the animal that's now circulating, coming out of the neck of the animal, right, from the slaughter. And that blood is basically going to be called, right, disqualify the rest of the blood because it's got blood mixed in that was in the leg of the animal, right, inside the animal, in the veins on the leg that came out, right, came out with the slaughter. So shma mina, are we to infer from here? Now, when we use this question, it's either because there's a machloket about this or because nobody really thinks this. Can we infer from here, dam muvla be'evarim damhu? So when I mentioned before that if you take blood outside the azara, it's after you slaughter the animal. If we accept the blood and then we walk the blood outside the azara, we disqualify the whole korban. But who says that blood that's still in the veins or the arteries, that's floating around the body of the animal, that was outside because the leg was outside, do we call that outside? No, dam, usually when we talk about the blood, it's after it was taken out of the animal's body, not in the animal's body, inside the Evarim. Like, that doesn't make any sense to say that that's blood that's going to disqualify because it went outside. So to fix that problem, okay, first we had to fix the blemish problem. Now we have to fix this other issue. They say Dilma Mishum Shamnunit. Maybe it's not the blood we're worried about. Maybe it's the fat of the animal, the meat of the animal that we're worried about. The fat is like the meat, okay? And that when you slaughter the animal, some fat comes out and gets mixed up in the blood. And that fat was fat that was in the body that came out. Now that doesn't bother them. I think the blood, because it's muvla be'evarim, it's basically, inside your body, inside something else, right? It's in the veins. It's kind of closed up in there. That's not going to be considered outside. But the flesh of the animal, we can say, oh, well, if the leg was outside and we now have, fat from the leg, that's going to disqualify it. So they say it's the meat. So now they say, wait a minute. Then that leads us to something I mentioned in the beginning of class, and this is why I mentioned it. Well, we're assuming this talks about koche kalim and kochim kochim. In other words, it didn't distinguish this halacha. So now, right, these rules about when it's, going to disqualify, when it's not. Shmat mina basal kochim kalim she'atza lifnei zrikatam pasul. Well, then it sounds like you're siding in this machloka, which, by the way, right, that this statement would side with a particular side in this big machloka between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. As I mentioned, kochim kalim, the meat can go out of the azara. While we were talking about blood, it was very easy because blood is a problem no matter what, right? The blood can never leave the azara. But once we move the discussion into meat, well, the meat of kochim kalim can be eaten outside the azara, so they can go outside the azara. Now, maybe before zrika they can't, and that's a big machlok at Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. But then they're saying, can we infer from the statement that they hold on that side of the machloket that even before, that specifically before zrika dam, even kochim kalim can't leave the azara, because that's what they seem to be saying. We're talking about the meat, and we're talking about theoretically also kochim kalim, not just kochim kochim. To which the Gemara says, no, dilma b'kochim kochim. Maybe this is only talking about kochim kochim. Maybe it's not talking about kochim kalim. Who's to say? And then it doesn't side on that side of the machloket that being outside the azara would disqualify it before the blood was sprinkled, even in kochim kalim. Well, not necessarily. Now, because we brought up this issue, okay, we keep getting off on tangent, because we brought up this issue of before zrikatam, are kochim kalim disqualified by being taken out? We're going to bring up a sugya relating to that. Tana Rabbana, koche kochim shchitatam b'tzafon, v'kibul daman b'klei sharei b'tzafon. So high sanctified offerings, right? That's like chatat, asham, ola. They have to be slaughtered in the northern part of the azara, and kibul daman b'klei sharei b'tzafon, and the accepting of the blood also has to happen in the north. Amad b'darom v'hushit yado l'tzafon v'shachat shchitato kshera. If you're standing in the south side, but your hand is outstretched to be on the northern side, and you slaughter the animal on the northern side, okay, even though your body is not, that's fine. But with Kabbalah, that doesn't work. Kibel, Kabbalah psula. In order to do Kabbalah, you have to be your body there. Okay, now how much of your body? Well, right? We generally go by rules of majority. This is relevant. We're in Chag Sukkot right now. If you remember, there was a big Mishna about Rosho v'rubo, machloket like there's a whole thing about Rosho v'rubo b'sukkah and Shulchano b'toch habayit, or Shulchano, all these different cases. But Rosho v'rubo is an issue. Like if your head and the majority of your body, that already is like your whole body. So it's as if your whole body's there. That's enough. Now we talk about the animal. That's what we were really talking about. If the animal in a koche, which it can't leave the azara, but it can leave the tzafon, okay? So basically, if while you're slaughtering the animal convulses and moves to the south side and then comes back, which by the way, they say it doesn't even need to come back, Rashi says. The reason why they said this is because of the next case. Kshera. Okay, the animal doesn't have to. This whole psul of yotze, okay, is leaving the azara. It's not related to the northern part where it has to be slaughtered. If the animal moves outside the northern part, it's still in the azara. It's totally fine. Okay, that's all koche. And the issue with koche is the north. It has to be slaughtered in the north. Kibul, the Kabbalah, acceptance of the catching, accepting the blood has to be in the north. But if your hand is inside the northern part slaughtering, that works. For Kabbalah, you need your whole body or a majority of your body. And the animal doesn't have to stay in Safon. If the animal moves, that's fine. Now we move to Kochim Kalim. Now here's going to be our issue, because Kochim Kalim, the issue is not going to be north. They don't have to be slaughtered in the north Kochim Kalim. They can be slaughtered anywhere in the azara. The issue here is going to be, what if it leaves the azara? And that's going to be obviously more strict, because leaving the azara is what we've been talking about, is very, right, ruins your korban. So what's going to be considered leaving and all that, that's partly what we're going to discuss. Kochim Kalim, shchitatam b'fnim, v'kibul damam b'klei sharei b'fnim. So it just has to be in the azara, and both the slaughtering and the accepting of the blood. Amam b'chutz v'yachnis yado l'fnim v'shachat. What if you were standing outside the azara, and you put your hand in to slaughter? Shchitato kshera, that works also. Your body doesn't need to be in the azara, as long as your hand is. Kibel kabbalato psula. But Kabbalah, just like before, we said your body has to be there also for Kabbalah of, right? Your body has to be in the azara. Now here we're going to differ. Now to be in the azara, you have to completely be in the azara. We're going to see this later, because it says, hevi'um. One second, I just want to find the pasuk. Front of show. No. Okay, we're going to see. Here. Leman asher yaviu b'nei Yisrael et zivcheihem asher hem zovchim al pnei hasadeh. So the Jews bring their sacrifices there. V'hevi'um la'Hashem. They have to bring them completely to God, they say. Okay, so you have to be there completely in that room. Pirkisa v'yatzta chutz la'azara psula. And in this case, if the animal flails and leaves the azara, it's a problem. And why? Because the meat can't leave the azara. What do you see here? And we're talking about Kochim Kalim. What did we say about Kochim Kalim? After Zrika, for sure they can leave the azara. What do you see here? Before Zrika was the question, the debate. So it sounds like because here if the animal flails, even if it comes back in, it's disqualified because it left the azara. What do you see here? Obviously it's an issue for Kochim Kalim to leave the azara. It's obviously before Zrika. After that, the meat is permitted. So what do you see here? We have this brighter sides on that side of the machloket, that it is disqualified before Zrikat down if it leaves the azara. To which the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Dilma ba'al yavi oteret hakaveru shtei klayot. Maybe it's talking about the parts that get burned on the altar. And those parts can't leave because those parts have to be burnt on the altar. They're just like the blood. And maybe this doesn't teach you anything about the meat at all. Okay, so that didn't prove anything in the end. Okay, one more thing about this, and from here we're going to get sidetracked to another thing. We have a lot of sidetracks today. The father of Shmuel asked Shmuel the following question. Now, at the beginning, it sounds like he's asking him a question because Shmuel is the big Talmid Chacham, and his father wants to know from Shmuel. But in the next slew of questions, we're going to have 4 questions. He's going to ask his son. His son's going to answer the wrong answer, and he's going to fix the answer to the question. So it seems like maybe he was just testing his son. So the father of Shmuel asked Shmuel, Hi b'fnim v'raglaha b'chutz mahu. What if the animal is inside, but its legs are outside? What's the halacha? Can you slaughter the animal like that? Now, it's true we started today with that case, and we said, if you cut the leg and then slaughtered, it's kshera. It seems like it's not a problem if the legs are outside, in terms of, right, if you, in the end, the shchita happens, as long as it's before Kabbalah, right, we changed that to say Kabbalah. It seems like the sacrifice is kshera. So why is he asking this question? Well, the commentaries say, he's saying lechatchila. In other words, that was talking about what if it happened? You didn't mean to do it that way. You didn't notice, let's say, you did it anyway. But can you go ahead and do that if you want? Can you just say, oh, it's fine, the legs are outside, I'm just going to slaughter the animal like this? So, can you do that? That's what I just quoted before. Hevi'um la'Hashem has to be completely in front of God. Now they ask, okay, now this leads to a slew of questions. For this, I'm going to share the study guide for today. It's a short study guide, just a chart on this section of the daf. But we're going to I wanted to chart it because it's much easier to understand this way. Okay, we're going to have 4 cases. Okay, it's an ABBA structure. We're going to start with the animal, then we're going to move to the person, animal. Okay, the person's going to be once the slaughterer, then the one accepting the blood, and then the animal. Okay, so we're going to go animal, person, person, animal. And we're going to have an ABAB in terms of pasul kasher. Okay? So that's just a way to a little bit remember and have it in your head. But don't worry if you didn't. It's fine. Tala v'shachat mahu. Now, we learned that you have to be in the northern part of the azara. Okay, it says v'shachat oto, you have to slaughter the animal. Al yerech hamizbeach tzafona, on the right side, the north side of the altar, on the north side of, that's basically the north side of the azara, which means it has to be next to the altar, and we're going to basically say that means on the ground. So if tala v'shachat, if the animal is suspended in the air, sounds like a Rabbi Yirmiyah question, mahu, what's the halacha? Amrale, right? So it's in the northern part, but it's up in the air. Amrale kshera. So Shmuel says it's kshera. Amrale. By the way, I didn't bring Shmuel here because every time Shmuel says something, his father's going to disagree. And what I really wanted to compare was what his father paskins, which is the right answer, so to speak, compared to what Abaye and Rava say. Okay, we're going to compare these. This is going to come up after. Amrale ishtabashta. You're totally confused, he says to his son. Be'inan shchita al yerech v'leka. It has to be shchita right next to the altar, and it's not. It's up in the air. Okay, second case. Nitla v'shachat mahu. What if the person, I told you we're going to go from animal to person. What if the slaughterer is hanging in the air suspended in the air while they slaughter? Mahu. Amrale psula. He says disqualify, just like the animal. Right? Once he said the animal, he said, also the slaughter. Amrale ishtavash. He said you're totally confused, or you made a mistake. Shchita al yerech v'lo shochet al yerech. It says v'shachat oto, slaughter it. Al yerech mizbech. So the focus of the yerech mizbech is on the animal, not on the slaughterer. If the slaughterer is suspended in the air, it's fine. Nitzla v'kibel mahu. So the first two were shchita. Now we're moving to Kabbalah, and like I said, ABBA. So we start with the animal, the slaughterer, and now we move to the kohen who's doing the accepting of the blood. Nitzla v'kibel. The person was hanging while they accepted the blood. Amarle kshera. He says, that's fine. Amarle ishtabashi. He said, you're wrong. Ein derech shirut bekach. Okay, now why did he think to say it's kshera? Because it never says the Kabbalah has to be done on. No, the Kabbalah does have to be done on the northern side, but it doesn't say so in the pasuk. Okay, so because it doesn't say so in the pasuk, it's okay if they're suspended. Also, by the way, if the shochet could be suspended, also obviously the kohen could be suspended. Right? That's another reason. In other words, the animal needs to be, we said, but not the person. So he thinks, it's okay. But now he says, no. Ein derech sherut bekach. Now, it says you're supposed to la'amod l'sharet l'fnei Hashem. You have to stand and serve before God. Now, remember we talked about the shchita is different because shchita is not like the same as all the other avodot, and because even a non-kohen can do it. So that's not called sherut. But when it's called sherut, like the Kabbalah, well, doing something suspended in the air is not an appropriate way to be serving God. So that's disqualified for a different reason. Okay, there's two main issues here, just to clarify things in your head. Number one, if it has to be done in the north, which we basically limit to the animal and being slaughtered, then it has to be on the ground. In addition, if it's sherut, well, the kohen has to be on the ground. It's not appropriate. What if the animal is hanging? Last question. Tala v'kibel, if he hung the animal and accepted the blood. Amarle psula, to which Amarle ishtabashta, you're wrong. Shchita al yerech v'lo kabbalah yerech. So the father Shmuel says no. The shchita has to be in the north, but not the Kabbalah. So therefore, if the animal's hanging, it's fine. Amar Abaye. Now comes Abaye and confuses things a little bit. He's going to distinguish between kochim and kochim kalim. Yeah. The issue, this is just very simple, because the issue, if we say there's two issues. Number one, sheru, or number one, tzafona. Well, tzafona is only an issue for kochim, not for kochim kalim. So in kochim kalim, he's going to disagree. Obviously, it's going to be not disagree. It's just going to give a different halacha, and that's why this is highlighted in yellow. Kochim kalim, wherever you needed tzafon, which is basically the animal can't be hanging when you slaughter it. Well, that's not an issue for kochim kalim because it doesn't have to be in the north. Because it doesn't have to be in the north, we don't need it on the ground anywhere. Okay? And then he's going to have one issue, and obviously the sherut is going to be an issue of sherut kochim kalim. But then Abaye is going to have one other thing he disagrees with. So Amar Abaye, what's weird about it is he says it in a very different way that without charting it and putting everything on paper, it's hard to really see where he disagrees. Because he, instead of saying, let's go through case 1, 2, 3, 4, he just says, B'koche kulam psulo, bar min nitzle v'shachat. B'kochim kalim kulam sheva, bar min nitzle v'kibel. He basically says, in kodesh kodeshim, everything is pasul except for if the shochet is suspended, okay, and that's kasher. Now notice, okay, well that's no different than what Avodah Shmuel said, because you don't need to be on safon. So what's the real difference? The real difference is, since he says they're all pasul, he differs on talah be'ema v'kibel. He basically says, since shechita has to be in the north, even though it doesn't say in the pasul Kabbalah, obviously Kabbalah has to be in the north, and therefore Kabbalah is going to be pasul also if the animal is suspended. Okay, it just extends the shechita of the animal to the Kabbalah of the animal can't be suspended. And b'kochim kalim, I already told you the difference, which is kulam kshera bar minitla v'kibel. Other than, right, everything is kosher except for hanging v'kibel, nitla v'kibel. Okay, if that's going to be disqualified because ain't sheru b'kach. But what the real difference is what I highlighted in yellow, which is the animals hanging in shechita. It's no problem because there's no obligation of north. Rava disagrees though. He says, Mishna talah v'kibel b'kochim kalim tikshera. Why do you say that talah v'kibel, the animal hanging in kochim kalim, is fine? Da'avir pnim kipnim dami. Okay, now it's true it doesn't need safon, but it does need the azara. And then you're basically saying if you're in the air in the azara, it's as if you're on the ground in the azara because it does need azara. So because kochim nami avir safon kitzafon dami. Now your theory that kochim kalim is going to be kasher because you don't need to be on the floor. Well, if you don't need to be on the floor in the azara, then you don't need to be on the floor in the tzafon, and you know everyone knows you have to be on the floor in the tzafon. So I don't agree with your distinction, basically. Ela amarava, bein kochim kochim, bein kochim kalim kshirot. So he basically says, oh, did I make a mistake here on the chart? Right, bar min talav shachat b'kochim kochim. Right, he still says the talav shachat b'kochim kochim is pasul. Okay, but he says everything else is going to be kasher, and nitla v'kibel bein b'kochim kochim, bein b'kochim kalim. Nitla v'kibel, he's going to say, is also, okay, he's going to basically say, okay, let's just say it again, everything is ksherot, other than, okay, talah v'kibel, talah v'shachat b'kochim kochim, and nitla v'kibel, whether kochim kochim, whether kochim kalim. Okay, and the main difference that he's going to have here is, just to focus, talah be'ema v'kibel, if you hang the animal and do kabbalat hadam, he thinks that's fine. He's still going to be machmir and shchita. Okay, what he's basically saying, being in the air is like being on the ground, but where it says it in the pasuk that it has to be in the tzafon, he's going to be machmir anyway. But when it comes to kibel, he disagrees with Abaye, and basically, if you look here, he agrees agrees completely with the father of Shmuel, because here, if you look in kochim kochim, okay, psul kasher, and that's exactly what Avodah Shmuel said. The only thing he adds, though, is in kochim kalim, well, there's no tzafon, so the animal can be suspended. Okay? And that's the disagreement between them. Okay? There we finish that. So yeah, now we have one last thing here before we go on to the next Mishnah. By Minei Rabbi Yirmiyah, mi Rabbi Zeri. Here comes our Rabbi Yirmiyah question. Hu bifnim v'tzitzito b'chutz mahu. If he's inside, but his hair is outside. Remember we talked about the kohen's not supposed to have long hair, but maybe he does anyway. He went against that. If his hair is outside, is that considered outside? Okay, if we said the Kabbalah needs to be inside, right? Now, we're going to say, and so now we're really saying when you slaughter it, okay, the slaughtering has to be inside. So Amrale, lav, now we had this whole thing. What if part of it outside, part of it, right? So now, lav amar tevi'um la'Hashem ad shtavo kula lifnim. Just like we said before, tevi'um la'Hashem. In Kabbalah, the whole thing has to, right, the whole animal has to be inside. Well, hachanami bevo amal, oh, sorry, there was the person actually, right, sorry, for Kabbalah, the kohen had to be completely inside. So here also we're going to say, even in shchita, at least most of the commentaries think we're talking about shchita here, hachanami bevo amal ol moed, it says the kohenim have to come into ol moed, so if their hair is outside ol moed, that's not completely. So they have to be completely in ol moed, and therefore it's going to be disqualified. Okay? So now, by the way, he didn't really answer the question, because, and the commentary says it's a bit of an issue here, because you could still be completely there, but with hair outside, maybe that's still considered completely. So he doesn't really address the question, but he seems to address it. It's just not in a satisfactory way, because you could say your whole body needs to be there. It doesn't necessarily mean all your hair. Okay, now we're moving on to the next Mishnah, and this is going to lead in all the way into tomorrow's sugya. There's going to be 3 interpretations of this Mishnah. Okay, it's a big basic sugya about how to read a Mishnah. Nitano al gabe hakevesh, shelo keneged hayesod. Nitati nitanim lamata lamala, v'et nitanim lamala lamata, et nitanim bifnim b'chutz, et nitanim b'chutz bifnim, pasul ve'ein bo karet. Okay, let's just start with the last words. Whatever you did here disqualifies. Now, I shouldn't say this yet, but let's just say, simple reading disqualifies the sacrifice, but you won't get karet for it. Okay, and you won't get karet, let's say, if you ate the meat or something, it sounds like, because usually karet is associated with eating the meat here. Okay, now, what did you do wrong here? You put the blood in the wrong place on the altar. There's places where the blood is supposed to go, depending on the sacrifice, and if there's this chuta sikra, this red line in the center of the height of the altar. Some sacrifices have to go on the top part, some have to go on the bottom part, some are put particularly right on the corners at the top, that's the ones on top. Some, the blood is brought inside to the inner altar, not the outer altar. So if you did anything wrong, something that was supposed to be below, you put on top, something on top, you put below, something inside, you brought to the mizbeach outside, or the reverse. Or you put it on the ramp, which is definitely not where it's supposed to go. All those examples, it's disqualified, but there's no karet. Okay. Comes Shmuel on Amud Bet, starting now on Amud Bet, and basically is going to explain this Mishnah differently. Amar Shmuel, pasul basal, aval ba'alim nitkapchu. He says, what's pasul? The meat is pasul, meaning you can't eat the meat of this sacrifice. But it worked. You got atonement. Why? My time, ada amar kra. We're talking about the blood in this pasuk, and it says, "Ani nitativ lachem al mizbeach lechapel." I gave the blood to you on the altar to atone. What's the drasha? Kevan shigia dam lemizbeach nitkapchu ba'alim. As long as the blood is on the altar, we don't care what altar, we don't care where on the altar. In the end, you got atonement. Now, obviously, you didn't do it the way it was supposed to be done, but you got atonement, which means the sacrifice is good. There's just one side point. This pasul is not the korban's pasul the way we seem to understand. And I read it. No. Just the meat is disqualified, which is the secondary part of this sacrifice. But your atonement was accepted. Okay, that's his explanation. To which the Gemara says, okay, wait a minute. Ihachi basar nami. If it was accepted, then you should be able to eat the meat. Why is the meat disqualified? That's question number one. To which the answer, Amakra lechapel. It says, I gave this to you on the altar. On the altar what? To atone. This was given to you to atone, so your atonement will be accepted. Nothing else. You can't eat the meat. It wasn't done properly. Okay? It was done properly enough to get atonement, but not properly enough to eat the meat. Now, here comes the big line, or one of the big things, which is Alma Kasavar, he must hold, Shelo bimkomo kimekomo dami. And that's going to lead us to some questions. Okay? One we'll deal with today, and one we'll deal with in the next stuff. He must hold that not putting it in the right place on the altar is as if you put it on the right place. In other words, location on the altar is not so critical. Okay? Anywhere on the altar is considered its place. Obviously, because otherwise it wouldn't have gotten accepted. Right? It's an obvious conclusion from Shmuel. But now we're going to have a problem. Because we're going to now read a Mishnah, the beginning of the next chapter. Okay, I'm going to read the whole Mishnah because we're going to deal with parts of this. And it's important to see it in its context. Right now what interests us is the end of the Mishnah. I'm going to start from the beginning. The beginning starts off with Kol hapsulim sheshachatu shchitatan kshera. Anyone who's puzzled to work in the temple can actually slaughter the animal. We learned that already, right? A zar, a woman, eved, a tameh. If they slaughtered it, the slaughtering is kasher. Okay, even koche kochim. Okay, as long as the tmeim don't touch the meat. Okay, I'm not going to get into all these details. Now, comes the big line. Since their slaughtering is kosher, well then, if they have the wrong intent, like chutz l'mkomo, chutz l'zmano, and all that, they can disqualify the korban because they're right. You can only disqualify a korban of pigul if everything else was done properly. We learned that. So here, everything was done properly. Now, if any of these disqualified people accepted the blood with a thought of pigul machshava, it's so not anything, okay? Because a disqualified person did the Kabbalah, therefore, and they had this pasol pigul machshava, which normally would disqualify the korban, but it doesn't because already you had something wrong that they were pasul. And not only that, but you can actually now have a kosher kohen come and accept the blood. In other words, assume there's still blood there in the animal, So, meaning this, if I came along, because I'm a woman, I can't do that. I collect the blood, and I have this pigo machshava. It's so off the charts, right, that someone else could just come and accept the blood and instead of me after. Okay, if there's still blood coming out. Now, okay, we're going to skip the next section, and then we're going to go to the end. Then it says, Nitanoa gabea kevesh. Now, it doesn't say who's the subject here. We're still talking about disqualified people or not. Okay, just note that. If someone, now we're going to have the whole list that we just had. Put it on the ramp, not keneged hayesod, the ones above, below, all those cases that we just had. Im yesh dama nefesh, if there's still more blood there, since it wasn't done properly, yachzor kasher v'yikabel. So a kosher person can come and take it and do it properly. Now, this is talking about the zrika, not the Kabbalah, right? But you go back to Kabbalah, take more blood, and go do it again. Now, what's the problem? So, T'nam b'idach pirkin, going back to our Gemara now, it says in the other chapter, again, Nitano al gabei hakevesh, lo keneged esav, blah, 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 all the things we just read. You can do it again, right? Someone can come along and fix it. Now, Isa kadatzach shalom komo kimikomo. Now, if, according to Shmuel, the korban was accepted. Now we have a big problem. If the korban's accepted, and basically this next Mishna is telling you, well, now according to Shmuel, the only thing that's disqualified is the meat. So what do you need to fix? Well, you need to be allowed to eat the meat. How can you eat the meat? Go sprinkle some more blood, and then you can eat the meat. Well, lama li yachzor kasher v'yikabel. How can he go back and do it again? Now, okay. The first question really is, we already said you got atonement. So what's the point of doing it a second time? Now, if you want to say it's to permit the meat to be eaten, what permits the meat to be eaten? The blood is sprinkled and atonement is achieved. But atonement was achieved the first time, and the blood wasn't permitted, and the meat wasn't permitted. So what? Now we're going to go sprinkle blood that has no meaning, because the first blood was already accepted. We're going to sprinkle the blood again, and it's not going to affect atonement because we already got atonement, and that's going to permit the meat to be eaten. That makes no sense. Okay, it was already done. You can't sprinkle the blood again when it was already done. You're not going to get atonement. If you're not going to get atonement, how's that going to permit the meat? So now, if we go back to understanding our Mishnah, the simple reading, we say it's disqualified. So the next Mishnah says, go do it again, right? But if it was accepted and it atoned, then there's no meaning to doing it a second time, and it doesn't do anything. And if it permits the meat, it can't permit the meat because the blood wasn't atonement blood. So the Gemara answers for Shmuel. Now remember, this is why I read you the whole Mishnah. The context there was disqualified people. So the way Shmuel's going to answer, we're going to answer the question for Shmuel is, Idi yave kasher hachinami. You're right. If that was a kosher person, like a kohen that did it the first time, you'd be right. The atonement would have been accepted. And there would be no point to do it a second time, and it wouldn't be able to permit anything. Hacha b'maya skina, what's the case? Diave pasul. There, it was talking about a disqualified person. Because a disqualified person did it the first time, no atonement was affected. Therefore, they're giving you a second chance. Kohen can, as long as there's more blood in the animal, go get the blood, go put it on the altar. And then that will permit the sacrifice. That basically will affect atonement for the owner. And then presumably it would also allow the meat to be eaten because now it was done properly. So basically, to resolve the contradiction with the other Mishnah, you basically have to say, our Mishnah was talking about a kosher person doing it, and that's why it worked, but the meat wasn't, permitted, and that because it was done in the wrong place. And the second Mishnah is talking about a disqualified person, and that's why the first act was nothing, and you can fix it. So now they say, wait, but how can you say that? How can you redo it? Now they're asking on that second Mishnah. If it was a puzzle person, it should be rejected. In other words, once someone who's the wrong person does it, it should be disqualified. Now, where do we get this from? Well, it's going to be an inference from an earlier line in the Mishnah, and that's why I read you that earlier line. Ditna. If they did Kabbalah, what did we say? Im yesh damanef, right? And then they had a pigo machshava. If there's damanef, yachzor kasher v'yikabel. If there's still blood in there, you can do it again. Kiblu in, here comes the inference, zarkulo. It only said Kabbalah is allowed. It didn't say Zrika is allowed to redo it. So it sounds like if it's for Kabbalah, a disqualified person did it, it'll be okay. You can do it, and it's not okay. You just do it a second time. But, meaning a kosher kohen comes and does it. But it sounds like, now this is just an inference, and soon we're going to say, no, that's not the right inference, okay? Sounds like Kabbalah, yes, Zrika, no. And what's the end of the Mishnah? a pasul person did the zrika. And then we're going to say, the Mishna says you can do it again. And as if we say that was a disqualified person, the inference from the earlier part is only Kabbalah we're going to let you have a second chance, not zrika. Zrika was done by a pasul person. It's dachui. What's dachui? It's basically a korban that was done incorrectly, and it's rejected, and you can't do anything with it anymore. My time, right? So again, if you accept this inference, what would be the reason? La mishum davi dachui, and then it doesn't make any sense. So they say, okay, the first attempt to resolve this is that's bishum de pasal b'machshav. The case, what was the difference between case of Kabbalah and the case of Zrika in the Mishnah there? The Kabbalah case had a psul machshava. That's why if you do Zrika with the wrong machshava, that's going to be dachui. But if it's just the wrong person, because that had two issues, the wrong person and the wrong machshava. If it's just the wrong person, then we're going to say, we don't have that inference, because the inference was from a case of two wrong things. So they say, or, specifically the psul machshava. Well, then they say, ihachi b'Kabbalah nami. So then they say, okay, if that's the case, then Kabbalah also, it should be a problem. It should be dachui. And it's why are we letting you redo it in a Kabbalah case if there's a psul? If you ruined it with machshava, and that's going to be so severe that you can't do Zrika anymore, you shouldn't be able to do Kabbalah anymore. V'od mi pasla machshava. And also, we know that the fact that you had a pibul machshava is irrelevant. That's the whole point. Because, first of all, it's what comes out of the Mishnah, the first part of the Mishnah, you'll see right now. And Ha'amar Rava, didn't Rava say, Ein machshava mo'elet ela b'misha ro'oi lavodah, b'davar ro'oi lavodah, mukama ro'oi lavodah. In order for machshava to ruin your korban, everything else has to be in place properly, right? You need the right person doing it, the right item that you're doing it with, and the right place. And if all that's there, then there is no pigul machshava. Remember, it's only if you're disqualifying it because of your machshava. It's disqualified for other reasons, it's irrelevant. So you can't say that's what caused it to be dachui in the Zrika case. It would have also caused it to be dachui in the Kabbalah case, and we know from Rava it's not a problem. So they now just change the inference. Lo tema zarak lo ela ema shachatolo. It's saying Kabbalah you can redo, and Zrika also you can redo. And then that fits perfectly with how we understood the end of that Mishnah. Zrika can be redone. It's not dachui. What can't be redone? Shchita. Why not? Because, remember, what was the case? If you're shochet, the azar, right, an isha, one of those psulim generally, well, they're allowed to do shchita. And therefore, what did the beginning of the Mishnah say? If they have a pasul machshava, right, you can't fix that because they ruined the korban. But when it's a pasul person doing it, the machshava, and with the wrong machshava of the Kabbalah or Zrika, that doesn't cause it to be pigul, and then you can redo it. So it's basically saying Kabbalah, yes, not shchita. Okay? Then the Gemara says, but that makes no sense. You're going to infer that from the case 2 in the Mishnah, but it says it explicitly in case 1. And this is what I read you in the Mishnah. We're going to read it again. My kamashma, the pasla machshava, what you're saying. The machshava of a shochet, who's a pasul person, right, is actually going to ruin the korban because they actually are kosher to do shchita. Well, it says it explicitly in the Mishnah. Ha kamashmanan, Tanina lefi chachem poslim b'machshava. Right, the whole Mishnah started off with because these people are kosher to do shchita. Therefore, if while they're slaughtering they say, "Oh, I'm going to, this blood is going to be sprinkled in the wrong time, or I'm going to eat the meat in the wrong time," then they ruin the korban, and there's no way to fix that. That's dachui, and that's the inference from the second part. But that's said explicitly in the first part. You don't need an inference when it's said explicitly. So they say no. Ha kamashmalan, and with this we'll finish today. What they're trying to tell you is the Mishnah starts off with shchita, then it moves to Kabbalah, and the whole idea we were trying to prove is that there's no dichui in Zrika of a pasul, right? It doesn't become rejected if a pasul person does something wrong. There's two things going wrong there. It's just completely like nothing happened, and you can redo it. You can find a kosher person to do it. So what it's saying when it says kiblu et adam, what they mean is from Kabbalah and on. That's what they want to say. Shchita, we said, doesn't work, right? It's going to disqualify the korban completely. You can't fix it. But then it says from Kabbalah and on, you can fix it. And then that fits perfectly with what we said. Okay, the next thing I'm going to leave for tomorrow because it starts a question that we barely even get into on this stuff, so I'm just going to leave it. Another difficulty on Shmuel. But let's review. Okay, so from the beginning of our daf, we started with this issue of the mum. Because of the mum, we got to, right, a mum even after shchita disqualifies. From there, we got to the statements. These statements made by Rabbi Elazar, which we kind of read, then we had to change them a little. which then seemed to indicate that if you cut off the leg of the animal, which really the topic there was outside, shchut chutz, right? The leg is outside and the blood is outside, and that comes into the body, which then we had to adapt, right? We had to say, first of all, the cutting off of the leg wasn't a mum. That was the issue, the side issue. Then, which was really the reason why we brought it. From there, we got to, it wasn't the blood, because then down be'evarim, we would teach about blood in the evarim. It's pasul. When it goes out in that, we go isn't. So it must be the meat. And then we said, from there it sounds like before Zrikat Dam, even for Kochim Kalim, right? Before Zrikat Dam, it would be pasul. From there, we got off on a tangent about that. And that Machloka tried to bring a Braita to prove that. Right? In the end, we said maybe it's just not talking about Kochim Kalim. And then we brought this Braita, and then we said when the Braita maybe is talking about the parts that actually get burnt on the altar, not the meat. So that didn't prove anything. And then we had this question. We had a slew of questions that the father of Shmuel asked. It started with this issue of the legs being outside, and then it moved to other issues of not being in the tzafon because you're up in the air suspended, or in derech shirupakach, right? And we had those different issues. From there, we had that last question for Yirmiyah with the hair being outside, and then we ended that whole issue of outside, which was a whole tangent we got off onto. Then we started with this new Mishnah about putting the blood in the wrong place, the altar, which we said is disqualified in the Mishnah. But Shmuel said, it doesn't really mean it's disqualified. It's actually accepted. The meat is disqualified. And that's a unique interpretation. We're going to see Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan disagree with him. Although Rish Lakish agrees with him on one principle we'll get to about the mikomo lav mikomo ki mikomo dami, which is the big conclusion we got to about Shmuel, which is not in its right place. It's actually as if it was done in the right place, because for the purposes of the blood, that's sufficient, just to be anywhere on the altar. And then we brought up this contradiction from the next Mishnah, to which he resolved by saying, how can you get a second chance if the blood was already done the first time? So that must be a pasul person doing it, which means the blood wasn't done the right time, and that's why you get a second chance, and here you don't. And then we had a whole big question, why isn't it dachui? And that we got off on a tangent about dachui, and, but we resolved it by saying the inference you made from the Mishnah isn't accurate. Okay, with that we finished for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom, Moadim L'Simcha, and we should hopefully hear good news very soon.